At 30,000 feet, the air was brittle and thin, a quiet so complete it seemed to swallow the hum of engines. The B-29 superfortresses sliced through the upper atmosphere, each silver fuselage gleaming in the waning light of late 1944. For the crews aboard, altitude was supposed to be armor, a shield against the defenses of a nation they had never seen from this distance. They believed the sky was safe. They were wrong. The first explosions shattered that illusion. Flak arced upward in perfect, deadly curves, black puffs erupting against the cold blue. The sudden concussion threw men from their bunks and instruments off the panels. The world shrank to a moment of chaos, the wind of the engines, the smell of burnt wiring, the flash of fire across the wingtip. Radar, once dismissed as primitive, now guided Japanese night fighters with alarming precision, their silhouettes appearing silently against the horizon, missiles of death in stealthy pursuit. Smoke filled the cabin. Shouts of "Evacuate!" rose above the roar, brittle with panic and fear. A young tail gunner grasped the rail, his fingers slick with condensation, and looked down. Below him stretched the Japanese mainland, a tapestry of cities, rivers, and forests he had studied in photographs but never imagined facing in person. He realized with a creeping dread that there would be no neutral ground, no promise of humane treatment, no protection from the laws he had trusted would exist in war. When the first B-29s limped toward emergency landings on hostile airfields, the promise of distance evaporated. Captured crews were met not with mercy, but with interrogation and punishment, sometimes cruel beyond comprehension. For these airmen, survival meant more than returning to base. It meant confronting an enemy prepared to rewrite the rules of warfare. The cabin, once a place of confidence, became a crucible of reflection, fear, and human limitation. In that thin, unforgiving air, a stark truth settled over the crews. Some would endure hardships far harsher than death itself. And as the superfortresses veered toward unknown fields below, no one could predict which men would see tomorrow, and which would vanish into history's shadows. In the distance, a faint flare on the horizon hinted at another trial, one that would test not just their courage, but the very definition of survival in the skies over Japan. Briefings in dimly lit rooms carried a quiet, unspoken warning. The words were careful, clipped. Capture by Japanese forces would be severe. No examples were cited. No stories were told. The ambiguity hung over the airmen like a frost in the cockpit, chilling yet invisible. What it meant exactly, they could only guess. A shadow of dread had been planted, one that would grow with each mission. Officially, the Geneva Convention of 1929 offered protection to prisoners of war, but in practice, Japan's adherence was partial at best. The law existed as ink on paper. The reality was harsher, inconsistent, and often cruel. A pilot might expect a treatment promised by international code, only to be met with interrogations, forced marches, or confinement in conditions designed to break both body and spirit. These were facts whispered in back corridors, never announced over the public address. Survival kits were issued, their contents precise and almost ironic. Flares, desalination tablets, emergency rations, and instructions for rescue at sea. The underlying assumption was clear. The ocean was the ultimate refuge, and the islands themselves were a hazard to be avoided. Men examined the kits with grim amusement, joking about never being taken alive, even as their laughter trembled with the tension they could not name aloud. The kits were a fragile reassurance, a thin layer of preparedness against a reality far more uncertain than anyone admitted. U.S. planners operating on incomplete intelligence assumed most down B-29s would ditch into the Pacific, far from civilians and enemy forces. But by the winter of 1944, that assumption was already failing. Crews found themselves falling over cities, fields, and villages where the rules of warfare were different, where mercy was a gamble, and where the consequences of capture could be immediate and brutal. Each crash landing carried not just the threat of injury, but the weight of an unpredictable human response from those below. Fear, subtle yet pervasive, settled like dust in every conversation. It was the kind of fear born not from sight or sound, but from fragments, rumors of executions, whispered testimonies from returned airmen, and the unsettling certainty that the safety they relied upon in the air might vanish the moment their wheels met foreign soil. The shadow of capture stretched longer with every flight, and no pilot could fully know who would escape, and who would be swallowed by the quiet terror of the home islands. Ahead, the next mission awaited, a winter sky thick with uncertainty, where the airmen would see. On front, the fragility of their assumptions and the relentless consequences of miscalculation. For many B-29 crews, the first faces they saw after the fall were not soldiers but civilians. Survivors drifting down on parachutes landed into rice paddies, factory courtyards, and narrow streets crowded with those who had grown accustomed to fear and loss. The air seemed to vibrate with anger, each shout and gesture a reminder that the war was no longer abstract. It had come to their homes. Crowds surged around the scattered parachutes, fists clenched, voices raised, a torrent of resentment and panic. In local police records, the entries were brief but telling. Enemy airmen found alive, crowd agitated. The data captured only a fraction of the chaos. For the men on the ground, the moment of landing was the collision of two worlds, the trained, regimented discipline of the U.S. Air Corps and the raw, unpredictable fury of a population under siege. One officer, a navigator or radio man perhaps, found himself at the center of this storm. Stones rained down and instinct drove his comrade to shield him with his body. Eyes wide, hands gripping canvas straps, he understood in that instant that survival was as much about human reaction as military procedure. The enemy was not faceless. It was human, immediate, and unforgiving. It was the Kempeitai, Japan's military police, who eventually arrived to claim the downed men. But there was no orderly procession, no calm extraction from a cell. Instead, interrogations began roadside amid the jeers and glare of civilians. Questions were sharp, deliberate, and uncompromising, asked in the open where shame, fear, and fury could intermingle freely. Every word, every pause became a test of endurance, both physical and moral. For the airmen, this was not routine captivity. It was a society under bombardment, reacting with the force of long-suppressed terror and frustration. The battlefield extended into the streets, fields, and villages themselves. Survival depended not solely on obedience, but on reading the volatile human environment, on understanding that war had blurred every line they had been taught to trust. As the crowds dispersed and the Kempeitai led the prisoners away, the men realized that the skies they had relied upon offered only temporary protection. The land below carried its own dangers, dangers that could neither be predicted nor negotiated. And beyond the horizon, the next confrontation awaited, one that would test not only their bodies, but the resilience of their very spirits. For Japanese authorities, the B-29 was more than a plane. It was a symbol of destruction, a weapon capable of ending the war before they could consolidate defenses. Fear of its impact drove every action, every strategy, every interrogation. The men who had flown those aircraft were not simply enemies. They were potential keys to unraveling the mechanisms of a war that threatened the home islands. The Kempeitai approached their duty with precision born of urgency, and with methods honed to exacting cruelty. Captured airmen were accused not merely of trespass, but of indiscriminate bombing, a capital offense under Japanese law. The accusations hung over them like leaden clouds, legal terms intertwined with moral condemnation, even before a single question had been asked. Each crewman entered the detention center blindfolded, hands wired, their senses stripped of orientation. The world narrowed to the sound of footsteps on concrete, the click of doors locking, the hiss of water, and the echo of voices in a corridor designed to disorient. The techniques applied were designed to fragment the mind and the body. Stress positions left muscles quivering, suspended in pain that blurred hours into days. Water torture introduced panic in measured, calculated increments. Beatings, sometimes random, sometimes rhythmic, imposed a physical certainty on the abstract terror that had been planted in the airmen's minds during their descent. Post-war trials would document these methods with meticulous detail. Yet in the moment, there was no record other than the sensations that seized each prisoner: pain, fear, and the relentless pressure of coercion. Cells themselves were instruments of strategy. Small, windowless, solitary spaces amplified disorientation, encouraging compliance and eroding morale. Silence became a weapon alongside the interrogator's questions, a suffocating companion that gnawed at the edges of resolve. Every detail of the environment, concrete walls, harsh lighting, the deliberate absence of clocks, was calculated to reduce resistance, to make confession more probable, and to extract the knowledge Tokyo believed could tilt the war. Intelligence gathering was methodical, almost scientific. The Japanese sought the patterns, the vulnerabilities in B-29 formations, the timing of missions, the weak points in fuel and ordnance management. Each revelation, each slip under pressure could be translated into tactical advantage. To the Kempeitai, the human cost of this extraction was secondary to the potential strategic gain. Yet the very rigor of these methods reflected a deeper belief. That knowledge of the aircraft, its crews, and their habits might delay or prevent further devastation across Japan. In the minds of the interrogators, every moment of suffering imposed on the prisoners was justified. They believed that the answers extracted from blindfolded, isolated men could shape the course of the war, slow the raids, and protect cities from ruin. For the airmen, each interrogation was a crucible of endurance, a test not only of body, but of spirit, against a system designed to strip away certainty, hope, and identity. And yet, as the days stretched into nights, a quiet determination persisted in those confined, an awareness that knowledge alone could not always dictate the outcome of survival. Beyond the walls of the detention centers, the skies waited, and the next mission, with all its unknown consequences, was already taking shape. In Japan, the air of war was suffused not only with fear of destruction, but with a moral code that shaped every action. The Bushido-influenced doctrine held that surrender was dishonor, a stain on one's family, one's unit, and one's nation. To die in battle was the ultimate proof of courage. To yield was to betray every principle of loyalty and self-respect. This belief extended, implicitly, to enemy airmen who fell into their hands. Surrender, in their eyes, was weakness to be exploited or punished. Training manuals reinforced this perspective. Enemy prisoners were described as weak-willed, lacking the fortitude to withstand pressure or hardship. The language was clinical, but the effect was human. Guards approached each captured B-29 crewman with a combination of expectation and incredulity. Some looked at men who had parachuted from the sky and surrendered rather than fight to the death, their faces reflecting confusion as much as authority. How could someone survive, yet choose to live on terms outside the local moral logic? Propaganda amplified this perception. Newspapers and posters painted the B-29 crews as city burners, architects of indiscriminate destruction against civilians. The image of the bomber was not neutral. It was incendiary, a vessel of terror designed to inflame hatred. Ordinary citizens, watching their homes and families endure raids from above, internalized these depictions. When airmen fell, it was not mercy they expected, but retribution. Civilians pressured local authorities to punish the men, to impose justice in immediate, visible ways. For the captured Americans, the contrast was stark. They had trained under the assumption that surrender might bring imprisonment, yes, but also humane treatment under international law. They had counted on procedures, regulations, and the predictability of the system. Instead, they encountered a reality governed by an entirely different set of premises: honor and shame, revenge and fear, ideology and local grievance. Their Western expectations of captivity collided with the psychological and cultural logic of a nation at war, producing a world where humane treatment was improbable and survival uncertain. The resulting environment was one of persistent tension. Interrogators, guards, and civilians operated under assumptions that the airmen could not easily fathom, and in turn, the airmen's survival depended on understanding, navigating, and enduring a moral universe that was not theirs. Misaligned moral worlds, one based on law and procedure, the other on honor, ideology, and communal memory, created a structural impossibility for compassion. Every interaction carried the weight of culture, expectation, and fear, rendering mercy rare and negotiation almost meaningless. In this landscape of misunderstanding and moral dissonance, survival was measured not only in hours or days, but in the capacity to interpret a society alien in both logic and expectation. And as the B-29 crews endured, an unseen question lingered. How could human decency persist when the rules themselves were unshared, and the skies above promised only the continuation of conflict? In the corridors of Tokyo, orders were issued with deliberate ambiguity. Central Command emphasized both the strategic value of captured airmen and the need to punish those responsible for the destruction wrought from the skies above. The language of the directives was precise in its phrasing yet vague in its intent, leaving room for interpretation at the regional level. Some officers read the words as a call for interrogation and intelligence gathering. Others saw license for swift retribution. As the orders filtered down, the consequences of interpretation became starkly evident. In one district, captured B-29 crews were held for days, questioned with methodical care, their interrogations designed to extract every fragment of tactical knowledge. In Anat, the airmen were executed almost immediately, the rationale unrecorded, the justification assumed. Data collected in post-war investigations highlighted this inconsistency. Some prisoners survived long enough to return home, while others vanished within days, leaving only rumors and the faint traces of official reports. One military doctor assigned to examine the captured airmen documented the grim reality with chilling detachment. In his diary, he wrote, "The airmen will not survive the night." The words were clinical, yet they revealed the interplay of authority, expectation, and resignation. Each prisoner's fate depended not only on rank or perceived intelligence value, but on the judgment, temperament, and circumstance of local officers. Survival was as unpredictable as the war itself. Bureaucracy added another layer of uncertainty. Paperwork delayed transfers, medical evaluations, and interrogations, leaving prisoners in a suspended state between life and death. Days stretched into weeks, the silence broken only by the occasional footsteps in a hallway or the muted commands of guards. Every moment in this liminal space intensified the airmen's awareness of their vulnerability and of the profound dissonance between official policy and lived reality. After B-29 raids struck major cities, the calculus of survival changed. Anger, fear, and grief intensified with each bombing, and treatment of captured airmen grew correspondingly harsh. What had been inconsistent became punitive. What had been cautious became vengeful. The skies above Tokyo had exacted a price on the ground, and those who fell into the hands of local authorities bore the brunt of a society struggling to comprehend, control, and retaliate against an enemy who seemed untouchable. In the end, policy itself became a mirror of a collapsing empire, fragmented, emotional, and unpredictable. Central directives lost coherence in the chain of command, leaving men in uniform to impose their own judgments on prisoners already at the mercy of circumstance. For the airmen, every interaction carried weight, every delay was a trial, and every encounter a reminder that the machinery of war could turn without warning, indifferent to individual fate. And as they waited, bound and disoriented, the next B-29 mission loomed in the distance. A mission that would continue to stretch the limits of strategy, courage, and survival in a world where the rules of engagement were fluid and the consequences absolute. Inside the confines of Kempeitai detention, survival was measured not in days or weeks, but in hours, each moment stretching into an eternity of vigilance and endurance. Prisoners faced a regimen designed to erode both body and spirit: malnutrition, exposure to cold concrete floors, and the relentless cadence of interrogation that left little room to breathe. At night, the hum of distant traffic and the occasional shout beyond the walls became markers of time, reminders that the world outside continued, indifferent to their suffering. Rations were sparse, often no more than a cup of rice gruel per day, thin and unseasoned, offering energy without satisfaction. Men counted morsels as if they were currency, calculating the endurance of their bodies against the demands of confinement. For those who had parachuted into foreign territory, already weakened by altitude and crash landings, every meal, or lack thereof, was a trial of both flesh and resolve. Wounds sustained during bailout or capture were frequently left untreated. A broken wrist, a sprained ankle, or burns from the fuselage could fester in small, windowless cells. Pain became a constant companion, mingling with hunger and fear, a silent assertion that the system cared little for recovery or rehabilitation. In the dim light of early morning, men whispered through walls, voices soft, tentative, seeking human contact where none should exist. These quiet exchanges were lifelines, a fragile thread linking one prisoner to another in defiance of isolation. Some were forced into labor that humiliated as much as it exhausted. Airmen paraded through angry neighborhoods as propaganda, eyes downcast, hands bound, a living symbol of enemy cruelty made tangible for civilians who had endured bombings from above. The streets were crowded with villagers whose loss and anger could erupt without warning, a reminder that the consequences of war extended beyond strategy and tactics into the realm of raw, immediate human judgment. Guards themselves were unpredictable. Their behavior oscillated between curiosity and violence, their moods influenced by rumor, stress, or fleeting impressions of the prisoner's attitude. One day a man might receive a cup of water or a word of instruction. The next, a blow or an extended period in the cold, confined space. The structure of authority was rigid on paper but inconsistent in practice, and the airmen's lives depended on the ability to anticipate and adapt to these fluctuations. Survival became a negotiation conducted hour by hour, moment by moment, with no certainty that the rules would remain the same from one interrogation to the next. The prisoners learned to measure every sound, every glance, every footstep. Small acts, sitting upright rather than slumping, answering questions calmly rather than defiantly, masking pain or fear, became strategies for endurance. Each breath drawn in that environment was both defiance and submission, a careful calibration between resistance and preservation. And yet in the quiet of the cells, beneath the weight of deprivation and fear, a different form of resilience took shape. Whispered words, shared memories, and fleeting human gestures reminded the men that they remained alive not only in body, but in mind. The system was designed to strip away certainty and identity, yet these fragments of connection preserved both, sustaining hope in a place where mercy was rare, and the consequences of misstep could be immediate and brutal. As night fell again, bringing with it the chill and silence that cloaked the cells, each airman faced the same relentless question. How long could they endure, and what would survival demand of them next? Beyond the walls, the war continued unabated, the skies above promising another trial, another confrontation, and the relentless reminder that in this conflict, endurance was the only measure of courage. For some captured B-29 airmen, survival demanded confrontation with a new, unimaginable terror. After initial detention, certain prisoners were transferred to facilities linked to Unit 731, a shadowed network where medical experimentation masked itself as scientific inquiry. The very act of entering these sites signaled that conventional rules no longer applied. The environment was sterile yet menacing, ordered yet cruel, a theater of human manipulation conducted in the name of research. Post-war testimonies would reveal horrors that defied comprehension. Airmen described being subjected to procedures designed not for recovery or understanding, but for control, observation, and injury. Vivisection, exposure to pathogens, and other tests were inflicted under the guise of scientific method, each procedure justified by ideology, each measurement recorded with precision, while the subjects themselves were reduced to objects. Pain, disorientation, and the uncertainty of survival became constant companions, stripping prisoners of both autonomy and dignity. Meanwhile, elsewhere, legalism became another weapon. Military tribunals were convened for captured crewmen, proceedings that could be completed in minutes if they occurred at all. In one case, a squadron navigator realized that the questions, the accusations, the judgments, every word of the tribunal, were incomprehensible, delivered without translation. He sat in stunned silence, acutely aware that his fate rested on gestures, tone, and the assumptions of men who had no intention of ensuring fairness. Legal procedure intended as a framework for justice had been hollowed into theater. It legitimized decisions that were predetermined, cruel, and fatal. The ideological framing of these acts was deliberate. Japan sought to portray executions and experiments as punishment for war crimes, a justification that reframed what was atrocity into the veneer of legality. Airmen were portrayed as architects of terror from above, responsible for indiscriminate bombing and thus deserving of consequence. The veneer was thin, but it served the purpose of absolving perpetrators in their own minds, transforming conscience into procedure, morality into mandate. Evidence of these abuses would later be meticulously documented by the U.S. War Crimes Commission. Reports cataloged transfers, experiments, tribunals, and executions, offering a record of cruelty that combined the pseudo-rationality of science with the performative authority of law. Yet no document could convey the lived reality, the confusion, the terror, the silent calculation that defined every heartbeat in captivity. For those who endured, memory became both weapon and shield, a mental ledger against forgetting that preserved identity even when flesh and circumstance were violated. In this environment, science and law, instruments normally designed to serve humanity, became tools of suffering. Experimentation, questioning, and procedure were stripped of ethical constraint, repurposed as methods to dominate, punish, and control. Survival was not measured in the application of skill or knowledge, but in the ability to remain conscious, coherent, and alert under conditions designed to extinguish both body and mind. And yet, even in the sterile halls and shadowed cells, small sparks of defiance endured. A whispered word, a shared glance, a remembrance of home. These were not acts of rebellion, but subtle assertions of life against a machinery of cruelty. The prisoners came to understand that the human spirit could persist even when science and law were perverted to destroy it. Beyond the walls of these facilities, the war raged on, its outcome still uncertain. The airmen's ordeal was only one fragment of a larger conflict, yet it revealed a stark truth. that the tools of civilization, reason, procedure, and knowledge could, in the absence of morality, become instruments of unimaginable suffering. And as the next B-29 mission loomed, the question remained: how could courage endure when the very definitions of humanity were being rewritten? Inside the walls of detention, amid the echo of footsteps and the faint drip of water, many airmen discovered a form of resistance that required neither weapon nor violence: silence. Despite the repeated and calculated application of torture, interrogators found that crews adhered with unflinching discipline to the familiar formula: name, rank, serial number. Every other question was met with mechanical precision, a recitation devoid of hesitation, devoid of meaning, yet full of defiance. The effect on interrogators was immediate and palpable. Hours of questioning yielded no insight into mission patterns, aircraft capabilities, or the layout of bomber formations. Frustration grew, sometimes into outright rage. In their eyes, the airmen's compliance with the letter of protocol was both maddening and incomprehensible. They had expected fear to extract knowledge, yet the men had weaponized procedure itself, transforming submission into strategy. One tail gunner, captured after a harrowing descent into hostile territory, refused categorically to describe bombing patterns, even as stress positions and repeated beatings threatened his endurance. Pain was present, relentless, yet he had discovered a new calculation: silence as shield, recitation as armor. In that refusal, he reclaimed authority over what was truly his to control: his knowledge and the limits of what he could surrender. Prisoners also adapted, developing improvised codes to communicate between cells. Scratched marks on walls, subtle knocks, brief hand signals through narrow spaces became lifelines, ways to maintain cohesion, morale, and shared understanding. In these moments, ingenuity replaced the weapons they had left behind, and intelligence flowed horizontally, defying the very system that sought to isolate and dominate them. Every coded gesture was a quiet act of rebellion, a whisper of autonomy against the machinery of capture. Morale drew sustenance not only from these improvised systems, but from the distant drone of B-29 engines overhead. Each mission that cut across the sky was proof that the work continued, that the war endured, that they were not forgotten. The sound carried a dual significance. It was both reassurance and reminder, a subtle reinforcement that their silence, their patience, and their endurance were part of a larger struggle still unfolding above the clouds. Ironically, this steadfast silence, the refusal to yield intelligence, denied the Japanese authorities precisely what they had labored to obtain. Months of planning, interrogation, and even experimentation produced little actionable insight. Every day of resistance became a small victory, a reversal of the power dynamics, a confirmation that control could be reclaimed even in the most constrained conditions. For the airmen, persistence was more than survival. It became an expression of moral agency, a deliberate choice to assert mastery over that which could not be destroyed. In their discipline, they imposed order on chaos, imposed purpose on suffering, and ultimately reclaimed dignity in a place designed to strip it away. Each recitation of name, rank, and serial number, repeated under duress, was a refusal to surrender the most essential truths of identity and allegiance. Even as the system sought to break them, they had discovered that endurance itself could be a weapon. The quiet, measured defiance echoed in cells, across courtyards, and through the memory of shared suffering. Their struggle was invisible to the casual observer, yet it carried profound consequence. It demonstrated that courage could take many forms, that resistance could exist in silence, and that human agency persisted even amid the machinery of oppression. And as another B-29 droned across the distant horizon, carrying its load to targets far from the prison walls, the airmen understood that their own mission, the preservation of knowledge, identity, and spirit, remained in motion. In that duality, survival became more than endurance. It became a statement, a final assertion of control in a world intent on taking it away. On the night of March 9-10, 1945, Tokyo burned like a city abandoned to fury. The firebombing unleashed by B-29s reduced 16 square miles of urban life to ash and ruin, leaving over 80,000 dead and countless more injured or homeless. The destruction was so sudden, so overwhelming, that it reverberated far beyond the immediate devastation. It reached even the cells where captured airmen waited, imprisoned for actions they had no control over once the bombs were released. Civilians, having watched their homes vanish in flames, their families torn apart, demanded vengeance. Words traveled quickly. The sky bandits responsible must pay. The anger was immediate, raw, and directed at those who had fallen into Japanese hands. Guards and local authorities, once cautious or bureaucratic in their treatment of prisoners, now faced a populace insisting that justice, swift, visible, and lethal, be delivered. The airmen, already subject to interrogations and deprivation, became unwilling symbols of the rage that consumed the streets and fields. Pressure from above and below reshaped the system of captivity. Prison authorities were compelled to relocate prisoners to hidden facilities, remote barracks, and secure compounds, sometimes hundreds of miles from their original holding sites. These movements were chaotic, disorienting, and in themselves a psychological weapon. Each transfer a reminder that control could shift at any moment, that safety was transient, and that the consequences of distant actions could arrive with sudden force. Executions, previously sporadic, escalated sharply. Interrogations intensified, questions becoming more pointed, methods more aggressive. The combination of public fury, military desperation, and administrative fragmentation created a climate where cruelty was amplified, normalized, and expected. Every action against the prisoners became a microcosm of a society under duress, a mechanism through which authority attempted to restore a sense of agency that had been shattered by the relentless raids from above. Strategically, Japan faced an impossible reality. The B-29s continued their missions with impunity. Anti-aircraft defenses, while improved, could not prevent the destruction raining down on major cities. The very air above Tokyo had become a theater where powerlessness was evident to all. Those below could neither prevent the devastation nor fully punish those responsible. Prisoners were caught at the intersection of these failures, human embodiments of vulnerability and symbolic targets for frustration that could find no other outlet. In this context, cruelty became both practical and emblematic. The collapse of military hope magnified every act of violence and coercion. Guards and interrogators, citizens and bureaucrats alike, enacted measures that were at once punitive and performative, projecting a semblance of authority onto men whose fates had already been shaped by forces beyond their control. Every execution, every intensified interrogation, was a reflection of a larger collapse, a society attempting to regain mastery where none existed. For the airmen, the nightmarish clarity of these dynamics became unmistakable. Their survival now depended not only on discipline and silence, but on reading the mood, anticipating the shifts in authority, and enduring cruelty imposed by desperation rather than reason. They had become symbols, not merely of conflict, but of the human inability to control catastrophe. And yet, amid the smoke, fear, and destruction, the distant hum of other B-29s overhead carried an ironic resonance. The missions continued. The war persisted. And for every act of retribution and escalation, the airmen's endurance quietly defied the logic of terror. In the ruins of Tokyo, both literal and moral, a stark lesson emerged. That powerlessness can amplify cruelty, but it cannot entirely erase courage, discipline, or the human capacity for silent defiance. Beyond the city, the next chapter of survival and struggle awaited, where the interplay of strategy, fury, and resilience would continue to shape lives in ways that only the skies could truly understand. By mid-1945, the shadow of invasion loomed over Japan. Local commanders, aware that the Allied advance could soon place the home islands within reach, feared that captured airmen might escape or be liberated before they could be used for intelligence. In the minds of these officers, uncertainty demanded decisive action. Prisoners were no longer abstract enemies. They were liabilities, tangible threats whose continued existence could undermine both security and honor. On Kyushu, between June and August, this fear manifested with grim efficiency. Multiple B-29 airmen were executed, often under circumstances designed to minimize witnesses and record. In some cases, prisoners were led from detention facilities to secluded sites, their hands bound, faces pale with resignation. Guards moved with purpose, understanding that each act carried both immediate and symbolic weight. Lives were extinguished quietly, yet the echo of each death reverberated across barracks, cells, and hearts, leaving an indelible mark on those who remained. Amid the terror, human courage persisted. One chaplain assigned to the prisoners offered words of calm and comfort even as he was led outside, a measured presence aga. Amidst the chaos and fear surrounding him, he spoke not in defiance, but in steadiness, reminding men that dignity could be preserved even when control had been stripped away. His voice became a bridge between despair and endurance, an anchor against the storm of violence that consumed those around him. Motives behind these executions varied. Some commanders acted under the guise of security, believing that eliminating prisoners was a preventive measure against escape or rescue. Others were driven by vengeance, fueled by months of destruction, fear, and humiliation wrought by the B-29 raids. Diaries and post-war testimony reveal the mixture of calculation and impulse that guided these fatal decisions. The records, though incomplete, document the chilling reality. Administrative order, ideology, and emotion intertwined to determine life or death. In parallel, some prisoners were relocated to mines and remote camps, disappearing from the records entirely. These movements were both strategic and punitive, removing men from easily accessible sites, concealing them from advancing forces, and often subjecting them to brutal conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Isolation became both a tool of security and a weapon of psychological pressure, further blurring the line between survival and punishment. Each execution, each relocation, reflected the pressures of a nation nearing collapse. Fear of losing the war shaped decisions at every level of authority, amplifying cruelty and constraining morality. Commanders confronted not only the practical problem of prisoners, but the symbolic imperative of demonstrating control in a society increasingly defined by desperation and disorder. Their actions, while intended to preserve order, instead created a legacy of injustice that would later form the foundation of war crime trials. In these final months, the B-29 crews became both witnesses and symbols. The executions at Sendai and Fukuoka crystallized the convergence of strategy, fear, and vengeance. Lives were measured against anticipated threats, the momentum of war leaving little space for compassion or deliberation. Men were reduced to variables in a calculation dictated by uncertainty and desperation, a calculus that magnified human suffering while preserving the illusion of authority. And yet within the confines of fear and violence, the persistence of human dignity endured in small gestures. The steady voice of a chaplain, the whispered encouragement between prisoners, the silent acknowledgement of courage in the face of inevitability. These moments, fleeting yet profound, revealed that even amid systematic cruelty, the human spirit could assert itself, quietly resisting the machinery designed to extinguish it. As summer drew on and the flames of war consumed cities and lives alike, the decisions made in the shadow of invasion would echo far beyond the immediate moment. The executions, the relocations, and the acts of endurance became both testimony and warning. That fear, when untempered by reason or humanity, could dictate outcomes as irrevocable as they were tragic. And beyond the walls, as the next B-29 mission roared toward the islands, the question lingered: how long could courage survive in a world intent on erasing it? In August 1945, the war reached a crescendo unlike any before. Within Hiroshima, several B-29 prisoners were held in the Chugoku Military Police Headquarters, a building that seemed a refuge from months of confinement and fear. Yet its location, near the city's heart, would soon prove catastrophic. The airmen, already weakened by long detention, were utterly unprepared for the scale of destruction that approached from above. At 8:15 a.m., the first atomic bomb detonated. The flash was blinding, a sudden inversion of day into flame. The ground trembled, glass shattered, and the very air seemed to boil. Those within the Chugoku headquarters were trapped by walls and debris. Many died instantly, consumed by heat, pressure, and the fury of a weapon whose magnitude defied imagination. For months, survival had been measured in hours, in careful discipline, in the quiet assertion of human will. In a single instant, all of that calculus was rendered meaningless. Post-war testimony from surviving guards paints a picture of stunned horror. They described corridors collapsing into fire and rubble, the walls of the building bending and breaking under forces no human hand could resist. Silence followed the flash, a silence heavier than any they had known. Before screams, the cries of the dying, and the collapse of the city's infrastructure filled the void. In that instant, the boundaries between captor and captive, between duty and mortality, were erased by a single, unprecedented event. On Nagasaki, another group of airmen suffered a similar fate 3 days later. The bomb struck with equal indiscriminate force, claiming the lives of men who had endured weeks and months of imprisonment. They had survived interrogation, deprivation, and relocation. They had endured both cruelty and isolation. Yet the very weapon designed to bring the war swiftly to its conclusion claimed them instead, leaving only fragments of testimony and memory for the world to record. Irony weighed heavily on these final moments. Airmen who had weathered the harshest forms of human cruelty, the calculations of fear, the application of ideology, the machinery of torture, were undone not by men, but by the culmination of technological ingenuity deployed for mass destruction. The distinction between captor and captive, between observer and victim, had vanished under the radiant force of an atomic sky. Survival was no longer a matter of discipline, courage, or knowledge. It was a matter of location, chance, and the limits of human comprehension. In the aftermath, those who survived, including some guards and officials, were left to reckon with the scale of what they had witnessed. Their diaries and post-war statements speak of disbelief, of a landscape transformed beyond recognition, of the fragile thread of human life severed in an instant. Buildings, streets, and the lives of tens of thousands were erased, leaving an indelible imprint on memory and history alike. The final chapter of the airmen's ordeal illustrates a profound truth about war itself, that its conclusion can be both sudden and indiscriminate, rendering months of calculated cruelty and endurance simultaneously insignificant and immortal in the record of human suffering. The atomic blasts became both a literal and symbolic erasure, obliterating distinctions between captor and captive, between punishment and fate. Even amid such devastation, fragments of humanity persisted. Survivors recalled the courage of those taken, the quiet discipline of the prisoners who endured until their final moments, and the stoic witness of guards who had been powerless to intervene. These remnants of memory preserved not only the record of suffering, but the assertion of moral awareness in a landscape otherwise defined by obliteration. As the dust settled over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war's final act was complete. The skies that had once carried hope, terror, and survival now stood empty, bearing witness to the obliteration of distinction, the fragility of life, and the ultimate cost of human conflict. The airmen's journey, from the heights of 30,000 feet to the confines of captivity, ended not with justice or mercy, but with the overwhelming force of a weapon that erased both suffering and agency in a single, blinding moment. And as the world began to reckon with the aftermath, the question lingered: could courage, endurance, and human dignity survive when the very instruments of civilization were turned into agents of annihilation? By August 1945, the machinery of captivity was unraveling. The war that had dictated every hour of a prisoner's life ended not with ceremony, but with sudden absence. Guards, once vigilant, became indifferent or vanished entirely, leaving doors unlocked and corridors empty. Food stocks dwindled. Rations that had been carefully measured and hoarded were gone. The airmen, many emaciated and fragile from months of deprivation, were left to confront a world in which control had evaporated as abruptly as authority itself. Visual markers of collapse were everywhere. Cells stood open, the scent of decay and unwashed humanity lingering in the hallways. Prisoners stepped into sunlight for the first time in months, their eyes adjusting to brightness after weeks in dim interiors. The simplest acts, unlocking a door, opening a window, breathing freely, carried the weight of miraculous possibility. Yet even amid relief, the memory of confinement lingered, a shadow tethering them to months of suffering that could not be undone. U.S. recovery teams spread across Japan, systematically locating surviving airmen. Reports documented emaciated men carried on stretchers, eyes hollow, bodies weakened by malnutrition, untreated wounds, and prolonged exposure to stress. Hospital ships moored offshore became temporary sanctuaries, offering medical care, nourishment, and the first semblance of safety in over a year. For some, the transition from captivity to care was immediate. For others, the body needed days or weeks to reconcile with survival, to recognize the paradox that freedom had arrived in a land still scarred by conflict. Documents discovered in burned and abandoned police stations revealed the scope of prior abuses. Names of missing prisoners, records of transfers, and execution orders emerged from charred remnants, providing evidence of cruelty meticulously planned yet ultimately imperfectly executed. Each page, each note, offered a glimpse into decisions driven by fear, ideology, or impulse, an archival echo of the human and administrative calculus that had determined life and death. Simultaneously, U.S. authorities began cataloging abuses for war crimes prosecution. Investig. Aiders compiled testimony, examined records, and sought to understand the mechanisms that had allowed cruelty to flourish under the guise of law, culture, and wartime necessity. Every report, every statement from survivors and guards alike, carried the dual burden of historical record and moral reckoning. Liberation was no simple triumph. It was the beginning of documentation, reflection, and accountability, a step toward understanding what had transpired and why. For the airmen, relief was inseparable from memory. Each step toward medical care, each hand extended in support, was tempered by recollections of what had been endured: interrogations, isolation, executions, and the quiet, persistent terror of captivity. Freedom was immediate, tangible, and vital, yet the weight of months in the system remained, shaping perception, emotion, and narrative. Survival had been won, but the imprint of experience lingered. In this fragile aftermath, human resilience became both visible and quiet. Bonds formed in confinement persisted, whispered encouragements and gestures of shared endurance echoing even as the airmen were carried to safety. The paradox of liberation was clear. Relief was profound, yet it arrived within a landscape still marked by absence, loss, and the lingering shadows of suffering. As ships departed Japanese ports carrying men back toward home, the survivors looked toward the horizon of reconstruction, memory, and justice. The world they returned to would not erase what they had endured, yet it offered the possibility of reflection, accountability, and in small ways, redemption. Liberation, finally, was both end and beginning, a threshold between survival and understanding, between suffering endured and the slow work of remembrance. And as the war's ruins stretched across Japan, the final question persisted in quiet reflection. How would memory, witness, and testimony endure to honor courage when the machinery of cruelty had sought to erase it entirely? In the months following Japan's surrender, the machinery of accountability began to turn. Tribunals convened in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Guam to prosecute guards, officers, and doctors who had participated in the captivity and abuse of B-29 airmen. These proceedings were meticulous, formal, and relentless, designed to reconstruct a reality that had been chaotic, cruel, and at times, deliberately concealed. Each hearing brought survivors into courtrooms for the first time, their voices fragile yet unwavering, bearing witness to atrocities that had remained unspoken in the months of immediate survival. Dozens of perpetrators were convicted. Sentences ranged from imprisonment to execution, the starkest serving as both punishment and moral statement. The records of these trials document not only the acts themselves, but the painstaking efforts to establish cause, intent, and responsibility. Survivors, emaciated in body but resolute in memory, testified about conditions in cells, executions in remote locations, and the experiments conducted under the guise of science. Each statement, delivered in a weakened voice or with measured composure, became a fragment of the larger narrative that would define historical understanding of these events. Diaries, orders, and forensic evidence provided the tribunal with corroboration. Burned police station documents, post-war recollections, and physical traces of confinement allowed investigators to reconstruct the trajectory of cruelty with precision. Each piece of evidence bridged the gap between memory and record, transforming anecdote into verifiable fact. The combination of testimony and documentation produced a chilling clarity. The scale of human suffering had been immense, systematic, and deliberate, yet the paths of accountability could still be traced through the layers of bureaucracy and ideology that had facilitated it. Legal distinctions were central to these proceedings. Courts endeavored to differentiate between systemic policy, decisions sanctioned by the hierarchy of command, and individual overreach, where cruelty exceeded directives or was guided by personal vengeance. These nuances shaped sentencing, revealing the complex interplay between obedience, initiative, and conscience in a society fractured by fear, ideology, and total war. By parsing intent from execution, tribunals sought not only to punish, but to understand, to make sense of the moral calculus that had permitted such acts to occur. Culturally, the trials forced Japan to confront actions long omitted from public discourse. Domestic silence was broken, revealing decisions and practices that challenged national narratives of honor, sacrifice, and victimhood. The nation faced a reckoning, not only with the external judgment of international tribunals, but with internal truths, that policies, procedures, and cultural imperatives had combined to sanction suffering in ways that could no longer be ignored or justified. For survivors, justice brought a measure of clarity, though not restoration. The tribunals acknowledged the cruelty they had endured and the lives that had been lost, yet no sentence could return months of deprivation, nor undo the psychological and physical toll exacted by captivity. Relief and validation were tempered by the weight of memory. The recognition of wrongdoing illuminated the past, but it did not erase the scars etched upon body and mind. Even as verdicts were read, sentences pronounced, and records filed, the enduring lesson was clear. Human endurance, courage, and discipline had survived systematic cruelty, and testimony itself became a form of resistance, a means of asserting moral authority against the machinery that had sought to erase it. The trials confirmed what had been lived, that even amid overwhelming power and deliberate inhumanity, witness and memory preserve the essence of justice, however partial it may be. And as the last gavel fell in courtrooms across Tokyo, Yokohama, and Guam, the survivors departed with a quiet understanding. Accountability had been achieved, clarity had been restored, but the world they returned to would forever carry the imprint of what had transpired, and the echoes of courage endured would continue to resonate long after the courtrooms emptied. The war had ended, the skies were empty, and yet the memory of those who never returned lingered like a shadow across the airfields, barracks, and homes of the United States. Over 500 B-29 crewmen had been lost, airmen whose aircraft had vanished over Japan, whose fates were obscured by distance, secrecy, and the chaos of conflict. Their absence was a silence felt in every base, in every household, in the quiet conversations of families who had prayed for news that would never come. Many remain listed as missing, their burial sites unknown. Official records contain only fragments, last known coordinates, eyewitness accounts, and post-war investigative reports. For historians, each note represents both a clue and a tragedy. For families, it represents an absence that no documentation can truly fill. The men who had ascended into the sky with duty and courage never returned to the world they left, leaving behind a void that could not be reconciled with reason alone. Letters arrived in homes long after the last mission, each carefully phrased but often revealing nothing. Families read between the lines, parsing phrases that suggested survival, uncertainty, or danger, yet offered no concrete answer. The correspondence was an echo of the bureaucracy that had guided both life and death for these airmen, a record of procedural care that collided painfully with the human desire for certainty. Every unopened envelope, every returned message, carried the weight of months and years of unanswered questions. The experiences of captured and lost crews shaped the post-war military in profound ways. Lessons learned from interrogation, torture, starvation, and exposure became embedded in U.S. military survival training. Protocols for evasion, resistance, and escape were refined, informed by the stories of endurance, silence, and resilience demonstrated by those who survived. These programs were a living memorial, a practical acknowledgement of the cost paid by airmen whose bravery had been tested in conditions far beyond the ordinary measures of war. Culturally, reconciliation followed slowly. Japan, decades later, pursued transparency efforts and hosted memorial visits to former prison and execution sites. Survivors and families of the fallen were offered opportunities to bear witness, to understand, and to engage in remembrance. The process was uneven and often fraught with emotion, yet it represented an effort to bridge the divide between nations, to acknowledge suffering, and to establish a shared memory of human loss and endurance. Philosophically, the story of these airmen teaches the fragility of moral systems under extreme pressure. Laws, codes, and conventions intended to protect the weak were at times distorted or ignored entirely, revealing how human institutions can fracture under the combined weight of fear, ideology, and desperation. The B-29 crews endured not only physical peril, but the moral turbulence of a system that could justify cruelty while claiming legitimacy. Their endurance, their discipline, and their silence became a testament to the persistence of conscience in an environment structured to suppress it. And so, the legacy of the fallen is not merely statistical. It is human, ethical, and historical. It resides in the families who never cease to hope, in the military programs that carry lessons forward, and in the acknowledgement that cruelty can exist even within organized systems. It is a reminder that courage may exist quietly, in procedures followed under duress, in lives preserved against the machinery of war, and in the memory of those who paid the ultimate price. They flew into danger expecting death, but not what awaited. Then below, a truth the world would only learn when the silence finally broke.